The book on which these lectures are based is in three parts. Part one deals with the Bible and Jesus Christ, and that's what the lectures so far have dealt with, namely the reliability and trustworthiness of the Bible, and that Jesus Christ is the divine Son of God. We've seen that not only the biblical statements, what Jesus himself said and did, but his fulfillment of prophecy, and then his resurrection from the dead. Part two of the book deals with the impossibility of the alternative. What do I mean? The great alternative to Christianity is the philosophy known as naturalism, namely the idea that there is no God, that everything exists is simply material, that everything that exists was not designed and created by a supernatural being, but simply is part of the way it is, and is the result of non-purposeful, non-directed evolution. That is the philosophy of naturalism. It is sort of the reigning orthodoxy in the West today, and certainly in most educational establishments today. We're going to be looking at this philosophy in a number of aspects, and will demonstrate that naturalism cannot even explain itself. The other alternative to naturalism is what's known as pantheism. Namely, this is the philosophy and it's the idea behind much of Hinduism and Buddhism, Eastern thought, namely that everything that exists is God, or everything is a manifestation of God, and we will be discussing that in part when pertinent. But first, a little bit of background here, because one of the things that we will be discussing in the subsequent lectures is the science, the reigning orthodox view of non-purposeful evolution. So at this point, I just need to give a little bit of background concerning Christianity and science, because before Charles Darwin published his book on the origin of species by means of natural selection in 1859, Christianity and science had been viewed as compatible, and that view lasted well into Darwin's lifetime. In fact, Alan Chapman, an Oxford professor of the history of science, has written that biblical faith, Judeo-Christian faith, is fundamental to the rise of modern science, because Christianity brought a radically new concept into human thought, namely a historical timeline, that there was a beginning, and there is a movement towards an end. There's a sequence of events which are related and make sense. And in fact, this view has been echoed by non-Christian mathematician and philosopher Alfred North Whitehead, who points out that the order of nature was, or the idea that nature had an order, was indispensable to the rise of modern science. And that idea came from basically Christianity and the belief in the rationality of God. Now, a number of writers who I quote in the book note that Western theism, particularly Christianity, was the basis for, historically, modern science, And so it's not surprising that throughout history, many of the great people of science were all Christians. And even today, lots of people in the different sciences are theists and Christians, despite the fact that, as I say, sort of the reigning orthodoxy in the West and in particularly Western academia are non-theists and naturalists. And that came about again after this situation came about after Darwin published his book on the origin of species, and so naturalism is also known as materialism or physicalism, and as I say, it's the view that there is no person of God, that there's no supernatural realm, and basically that there's no spiritual realm, that everything that exists is basically all matter and motion. In other words, all of existence is what is known as a closed system. There is nothing outside of nature. And so any activity is simply a process involving material entities occurring within space and time. And so naturalists believe that physics is a closed system. Nothing other than physics explains where any particle is at any particular time. Physics is mechanistic. In other words, the purposes do not, no outside purposes or goals or explain why things are the way they are or where particles go. And all states in space and time, chemical, biological, psychological, sociological, economic, are the way they are because physics is the way it is. In short, there is nothing outside of the system of nature. Now, this view of necessity entails the idea that the universe and all that exists came into being as a result of an unguided and undirected evolutionary process, that life somehow emerged from non-living matter, that that only purely natural means are used. The late well-known astronomer Carl Sagan famously put it, "The cosmos is all that is, or ever was, or ever will be." Now, this philosophy, as I say, it's sort of the reigning orthodoxy in Western science today, in Western academia, and as one writer says, it's the most influential idea of our time. Another naturalist, an atheist, says that this whole idea of Darwinian evolution, unguided Darwinian evolution, is a universal acid that eats through just about every traditional concept and leaves in its wake a revolutionized worldview. Now, this worldview, as I think you can see, is a direct frontal challenge to and contradiction of Christianity and indeed all forms of theism. And as Philip Johnson said, if naturalism is true, then humankind created God, not the other way around. And so because this view is so dominant and is a direct confrontation to and contradiction of Christianity, that is why we are dealing with it in this book, and I will look at this in subsequent lectures. And as Christian philosopher Alvin Plantinga said, if you reject theism, then naturalistic evolution is the only game in town. Now, as I pointed out, however, it need not be that way, because historically, I mean, as I alluded to, Christianity is the very basis of the existence and led to development of modern science. Many, if not most, of the great scientists throughout history have been Christians, and today multiple Christians are practicing in the various specialties within science. And so Christianity is not opposed to science. This whole metaphysical naturalistic philosophy is what Plantinga and others say is simply a philosophical add-on to science that is not necessary for science to take place. Now, so I want to take a look at the fact, as I mentioned, naturalism cannot even explain itself. It is inherently self-refuting. It is incoherent. What do I mean? Well, back in the mid-1700s, the well-known philosopher who was not a Christian, named David Hume, English philosopher, said that we all infer that the future is going to be like the past, that nature is regular. However, he made the point that all of our inferences from experience suppose, as their foundation, that the future will resemble the past. But we have no basis for inferring that. In other words, what happens sometimes does change. So if this happens sometimes, and with respect to some objects, why may it not happen all the time with respect to all objects? How can you argue this? Because what his point is that everyone assumes that the future will be like the past based on past experience, but you can't extend. All we know is the past, and so we can't say that nature is regular because we can't see the future. In other words, philosopher Bertrand Russell, also an atheist, agreed that when you argue for the uniformity and regularity of nature based on past experience, that begs the very question at issue, because you're assuming in advance that nature is uniform and regular. Another contemporary scientist, Francisco Ayala, says, induction fails to arrive at universal truths. No matter how many regular statements may be accumulated, no universal statement can be logically derived from such an accumulation of observations. In other words, that, as Bertrand Russell pointed out, the principle of induction, in other words, you look at something and you induce or come to a conclusion as to the underlying principles, while that principle is necessary to the validity of all arguments based on experience, it itself, the principle of induction, is not capable of being proved by experience, yet it's believed by everyone. The point is that naturalism provides no basis or foundation or reason for assuming the regularity and uniformity of nature. It cannot account for abstract universals. What is an abstract universal? An abstract universal is something like the laws of logic, of truth, the laws of nature, because all of those things, naturalism says the only thing that exists is matter and motion with no plan, design, or purpose. Naturalism asserts that only concrete physical or material particulars exist, atoms, electrons, and so on and so forth, and that everything that happens occurs as the result of physical forces. And it denies, naturalism denies, that anything immaterial, spiritual, or supernatural exists. But all such abstract universals, such as the laws of logic, such as truth, such as laws of nature, they're not physical or material at all, but they are immaterial and invariant. In other words, they don't change. Regardless of time, place, or circumstances, they are invariant. They do not vary. These abstract universals are independent of time, space, and the physical properties of the universe. And therefore, if naturalistic materialism is correct, such abstract universals cannot exist. But they do exist, and everybody, including naturalists, know they do. You see, the rules of logic must be universally correct and normative, in other words, true, and actually show us which inferences are correct. Because if the rules of logic are merely accidents of evolution, there's no reason to think that they are truly and universally normative and correct. In other words, if naturalism is true, the rules of logic themselves are no longer normative and true, but are believed only because certain physical events in nature and the motion of atoms and chemical processes in our brains cause us to think or believe that our inferences are true. But if that's the case, then there can be no such thing as a rationally justifiable belief, including belief in naturalism itself. C.S. Lewis made the point that one kind of thought, logical thought, cannot be subjective and irrelevant to the real universe. For unless thought is valid, we have no reason to believe in the real universe itself. And he says this admission seems to be completely unavoidable, and it has momentous consequences. In the first place, it rules out any materialistic account of thinking. And yet that's what naturalism holds. Naturalism holds that mind was derived from non-material physical forces, and that the thoughts we think are simply the result of the movement of atoms in our brains. In other words, that they're simply physical. But as Lewis points out, that cannot possibly be true, because if it were, we have no reason to trust what we believe. Now, the major alternative to naturalism is pantheism. Again, that's the idea that all is God and all is one, that everything flows from God like a flower unfolding from a seed. Now, pantheistic religions and philosophy say everything is simply a manifestation of God, and that any diversity of reality is just different ways or modes of the one true reality, namely God. Now, the pantheistic idea of God is not the God of the Bible, but is saying that everything, the universe, is God, or it's infused with God. And pantheism holds, therefore, that anything that appears to exist, that all differences among things are simply an illusion, that it's all part of the one God. Now, this view is likewise self-refuting. First, because if all is one, then all distinctions between premises and entities are an illusion. We couldn't know it, because such a state is contrary to the laws of logic and therefore of reality. You see, if that were the case, if all is one and any claimed distinctions between you and me or this and that is simply an illusion, no one could justify or explain anything, even pantheism itself. Secondly, If existence is simply the emanation of an absolute spirit, the God of pantheism, then reality is not ultimately predictable or provable. Also, a pantheist must affirm that God is, but I am not. But that is also self-refuting, because you must exist in order to affirm, a person must exist in order to affirm that he doesn't exist. And also, if God is all there is and is coextensive with the universe, as pantheism holds, then pantheism is equivalent to atheism and naturalism. The only difference is that the God, both hold that either God, pantheism, or the material universe, atheism, is all that exists. In other words, the God of pantheism is not outside of the universe, but is the universe, or is part of the universe. The only difference is that a pantheist decides to attribute religious significance to the all, and the atheist does not. But all are saying that only the universe exists, and either it is a manifestation of an essentially impersonal God, or there is no God. But they're both holding essentially the same thing. Now, in contrast to that, of course, there is theism, Christianity in particular, which provides a coherent and reasonable explanation for abstract universals and the regularity and uniformity of nature. Because, see, Christianity can account for existence, unlike, and is not internally incoherent or self-contradictory, because, you see, God is a being outside of the universe who created the universe. God's mind gives both diversity and gives order to all things. And Hebrews chapter 1, verse 3 tells us that the eternal Son of God upholds all things by the word of his power. In other words, God is active in upholding and sustaining the world now. There is an order because God knows the end from the beginning. You see, naturalism assumes that abstract universals, such as the laws of logic, truth, the laws of nature, and the regularity and uniformity of nature, it simply assumes them, but by its very nature, naturalism cannot account for these things. But so what naturalism does essentially has to assume a theistic worldview as the precondition for understanding everything. In fact, even theoretical physicist Paul Davies admits that even the most atheistic scientist accepts as an act of faith the existence of law-like order in nature, and that is at least in part comprehensible to us. So science can only proceed only if the scientist adopts an essentially theological worldview, because naturalism, again, cannot account for abstract universals, for logic, for the reliability of mind, and so on. Only theism and Christianity can account for these things, because, in Christianity, as the Bible says, God is the one. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. So God is not one with the heaven and the earth, but is outside of them. And he is the one who gives us mind, and therefore we can trust our minds, as everyone does, because our thoughts are not simply the material motion of atoms in our brains. C.S. Lewis has argued for this, it's called the argument from reason. He talked about this a lot in his book Miracles and in other places. And philosopher Alvin Plantinga has a similar argument called the evolutionary argument against naturalism. And essentially, as Lewis points out in his argument, that if everything that exists is part of a closed material system of nature, then physical forces cause everything. There's an unbroken chain of physical causes. But that can't possibly be the case because that means everything is determined. Determinism is true because what happens now is because of a previous physical state of events going all the way back. But if that is true, then we have no reason for believing that, because my arguments or my belief in determinism is simply determined. And I have no reason to believe that it's true. It's simply the way the atoms in my brain are working, and they're working away because I have done this, and so on and so forth. You see, according to naturalism, mind is nothing more than the neurological impulses in our physical brains. And yet, naturalism points to that very organ, our brain, that generates the impulses. It's supposed to independently somehow verify the truth or falsehood of the thoughts it has. And so evolutionist J.B.S. Haldane admitted that if my mental processes are determined wholly by the motions of atoms in my brain, then I have no reason to suppose that my beliefs are true. They may be sound chemically, but that does not make them sound logically. And hence, I have no reason for supposing that my brain is composed of atoms. Lewis made a similar point when he said that that naturalism presupposes that all of our thoughts are simply the accidental byproduct of movements of atoms in our brain. Lewis said, since that's the case, I see no reason for believing that one accident should be able to give me a correct account of all other accidents. It's like expecting that the accidental shape taken by the splash when you upset a milk jug should give you a correct account of how the jug was made and why it was upset. You see, again, naturalism is what is known as self-refuting. It's self-contradictory. It is not able even to explain itself, because the naturalist makes arguments in favor of his position, but why believe him? Because, according to him, his thoughts, even about naturalism itself, are simply the accidental byproducts of the motion of atoms in his brain. And so the fact is that mind is not simply the physical factors of the accidental motion of atoms in our brain. For example, that our thoughts, our inferences, our reasoning are not part of nature in and of itself, but are in a sense beyond nature. And so, that has to be true. Otherwise, we can't believe or know anything, since everything is just physical. And so, again, naturalism gives us no basis to think that our reasoning is valid. And as one philosopher points out, only conscious minds can have plans and purposes. So there's no plan or purpose that will ensure that if naturalism is true, our reasoning will attain truth. Forces that are without our mind might happen to give us powers of valid reasoning, but they might not as well. So we can't trust, if naturalism is true, that our reasoning is valid or means anything. So again, naturalism entails the view that mindless forces produce mind, that irrational forces produce reason, that material forces produce things that are immaterial, reasons, ideas, numbers. And naturalism entails the view that concrete particulars, atoms, electrons, produce abstract universals, the laws of logic, truth, the content of propositions, and that a closed interlocking system with nothing outside of it produces something that by its very nature is outside the system, namely our minds and reason. So existence is rational and understandable only if our rational capacities are non-physical, non-mechanical, non-accidental, non-blind. And that is exactly the way they are. Because one philosopher, Richard Taylor, gives an example of this. He says, suppose you're on a train and you see on a hillside a pattern of several white stones that resembles the letters that say this: the British Railways welcomes you to Wales. Now, if you conclude that you are in fact entering Wales, it would be irrational for you to regard the arrangement of the stones as evidence that you were entering Wales, and at the same time suppose that that arrangement just came about by accident as the result of the ordinary interactions of nature and physical forces. In other words, the arrangement of those stones shows that they were designed and they have a content or meaning, that they are saying something, that they came from someone's mind first, who then designed that, because it's irrational to believe that they could only be there as a result of irrational physical forces. So what Taylor is pointing out is that meaning comes only from a rational agent. And if the stones did not come from a rational agent, they would have no meaning. And the second point here is that meaning must exist in the mind of a rational agent before the stones are arranged, because it is the meaning that determined their order when the stones were arranged. So meaning cannot be identified with the stones themselves, nor can the meaning emerge from the stones, but meaning comes only from mind. One other philosopher makes the point that any view holding that the ultimate constituent of reality is mental, and the ultimate explanations that go to the decisions of mind is some kind of supernaturalism, we must presuppose a benevolent creator. Because if a malign or evil genie is behind the scenes, then our rational capabilities are no more trustworthy than if blind naturalism were in charge. In other words, the reason that we think the way we do can only be explained ultimately by a benign, intelligent creator. That creator is God. Naturalism cannot account for reason, logic, meaning, truth, and the only viable explanation is a benevolent creator, just as the Bible and Christianity state. And so Christianity is not self-refuting, as is naturalism or pantheism. And the reason, of course, is that God has a mind. God made mankind in his image, and he gives us the ability to reason. God is a rational God and is necessarily so, and therefore logic and reason are ultimately based on God's own character. And as Philip Johnson concludes, if our minds are created in the image of the maker of the entire universe, God, then we have reason for confidence in our own rationality. In other words, Christianity alone provides the basis for reason and the trustworthiness of our reason. Naturalism does not and cannot even explain itself. We will be looking in subsequent lectures in more detail at some of the science and other areas whereby naturalism cannot explain any aspect of creation, but Christianity does.